Welcome to Interface Studies. My name is Saleh. In a previous video, I mentioned very quickly that some part of the interface, settings, seem to have grown out of control. It wasn't the first time that this specific idea occurred to me. I personally face it every time I open settings on my phone. I'm noticing that they have grown so much that I cannot keep up, although I try to. A couple of months ago, I was trying to change a rule for a child account. What seemed to me like a simple thing took me through accounts, took me through screen time, many screens that I had to drill through. In most of these cases, I forgot where I was. The challenge is that I am not new to iPhone. I have used it for a very long time. I know about the settings there. I've watched it grow over the years. From these phone-specific things that I was familiar with to these new things that I had to learn. Things like payments, things like the connected devices, the home app, different types of wallets, child accounts. So the question here, why is this happening to me? Is this a me-only problem, or is there more into it? Why do I have this problem with the settings on my phone? This video is an attempt to understand why. The first thing that I'm going to start with is very simple, and it is actually based on the original video where I mentioned this. To summarize it very quickly, as graphical interfaces and software in general grew, they landed on recognition rather than recall. That's what made graphical interfaces very popular. Show people the commands and objects available, and people will recognize what to do instead of remembering a command and typing it correctly. The old way of doing things. This is how we got menus. This is how we got buttons and tabs and toggles. All of these elements, or controls, made software's possibilities visible. Over the years, and with a lot of adjustments, this has transferred to phones. Software, however, kept growing. We needed more controls. Some of those controls stayed near the activity they affected. Others moved into menus, preferences. On phones specifically, where the space is very limited because of the screen size, we ended up with global settings screen. And those screens grew, and they grew from a time where the search was hidden to being very visible. Now, I'm saying all this, and I have to say that this did not happen in a vacuum. Things did not just grow randomly. Settings design evolved. We have many best practices now. Things like logical grouping, hierarchies, clear copy. Companies pay a lot of attention to these settings. But that doesn't change the fact, or at least the feeling that I have, that there are too many settings. As I said earlier, search is there. And if we open the settings screen on any modern phone, we see how prominent search is. Search helps a lot in a screen like settings, and in recent iOS releases, search has become almost central. It wasn't hidden where you have to drag to show it. It's now part of the interface. And the same applies to Android, by the way. However, one key thing that we have to always keep in mind when it comes to search. Search only works once I know what the system calls the thing I want. And a simple example may help here. If a user came and said, well, I have this device and the text there is very hard to read, what do I do? What the system offers and what the user wants are two different things. The system offers text size, display zoom, larger text, controls for things like contrast, transparency. So, based on that, in theory, the solution is there. But the way the user, or most of us users, understand this problem differs from how it is designed in the system. This is the key difference between our language as users and the system's language designed by whoever was responsible for it. Now, this difference, or this gap between user's language and system's language, is not a unique thing to me. There's even a famous paper from the 80s titled The Vocabulary Problem in Human-System Communication. Researchers asked people to name things across 5 different kinds of software. Then, they checked how often any 2 of them chose the same word. It came out under 20%. And one of the interesting findings there is that if you give something one official name, chosen by whoever designed it, people who are looking for it will miss it. And that is 8 or 9 times out of 10. Now, this paper is old. It's about 40 years old. And settings design, as I mentioned earlier, did change since. We have best practices now, and we are very familiar with our devices. We spend too much time with our phones, so familiarity should help here. But when it comes to language and how we perceive certain things named by the system, things are still complicated, and things vary between people and languages. There's a related study from 2026, which is very recent, that kind of confirms that. It was titled Voice Align, a shimmering layer for enhancing the usability of legacy voice user interface systems. Now, the study is about voice interfaces, not settings screens. But in this study, users kept producing minor variations of fixed commands that the system could not accept. The preferred word in the system cannot safely stand in for the range of words users produce. Again, this is a very search-specific problem, and I wanted to start with it to get it out of the way because we will kind of get back to it towards the end. And I wanted to start with search because it is the thing that we can bring up against any too many kind of argument. If you can search for it, what's the problem? But the problem, again, is very simple. How can I remember and retrieve what the system wants to see the appropriate settings, especially when it comes to search? To be honest, all of this lengthy intro is for me to ask a simple question. Are we living at a time where there are too many settings? Is this even the right question? One idea to deal with it, because there's no direct way to measure how many settings we have on iOS and Android, and I want to talk about phones specifically here, against what users actually think of them, and I'm not aware of any study around that specific topic. But one thing that can help us with this too many question is to think of it slightly differently. Too many doesn't mean a count. We can think of it as a comparison. So throughout the rest of this video, my aim is to simply try to split that too many question into 3 smaller ones. One is checking if we have too many settings to find. The second is if we have too many for anyone to actually need. And the third is if we have too many for us to know what we have already set. Because settings eventually are things that we have control over and we set according to our preferences. These are 3 different things. Let's go through them in order. The first one is if we have too many settings to find, so it's a finding problem. In 2023, Samsung Research did a study of the search inside its own settings app. They looked into 563 features there. When test queries used the feature's exact name, it did very well. But when the queries used alternative words for the same search, the accuracy collapsed. And when the query was an ordinary sentence describing the problem, the right answer appeared in the top 5 results in a ratio of a bit lower than 20%. Now, in that study, the queries were written by Android experts, and Samsung did not collect real users' queries for privacy reasons. So what this study tells us, and it is relatively recent, is that there is some kind of verification for this vocabulary problem. It shows on the phone. It also confirms that companies are aware of this problem, the problem of settings, because they researched it. And if we look at the Android open source project, especially when it comes to settings design guidelines, we see very interesting recommendations. One of them tells us something very important, which is that we have to put a setting in 2 different screens to make it easier to find. This means that the solution to the findability problem is simply duplication. No single location in this hierarchy of settings is the correct one. There's no right answer. The advice is to always do the best you can in your settings screen, but also duplicate settings in different areas. So that helps us understand the first question. There is a findability issue. Partly it's because of the language problem that we spoke about earlier, partly because there's simply no right way of designing a screen interface. Duplication is as important. Let's go now to the second question. If we have too many settings for anyone to need. Now, there is no direct evidence for this as far as I can tell. No one has counted phone settings against phone users' needs. But one field has counted something very similar: server software. It's usually administered by its own professionals. Now, in 2015, researchers at UC San Diego and the storage company NetApp published a very relevant study titled, "Hey, you have given me too many knobs." It's a perfect title for our case here. What they tracked was the configuration parameters across 4 major systems over their whole history. And they also collected the actual configuration files of thousands of customers of a commercial storage system, plus hundreds of Apache and MySQL users. Their aim was to see which parameters anyone ever touches. Let's go through the findings quickly. We'll start with growth. Hadoop's MapReduce went from 17 parameters in its first release to 173 7 years later. MySQL reached 461. Apache passed 550. The interesting thing there is that parameters were being removed about 7 times more slowly than they were being added. This means that once a setting exists, it almost never leaves. And when it comes to usage across their studied systems, only somewhere between 6 and 17% of the parameters were set by a majority of users. Up to 54% were set by fewer than 1 in 100 users. In a commercial system, nearly a quarter of all parameters had been set by nobody at all. The paper also quotes a developer discussion about whether to expose an internal value. And in that discussion, the developers were not sure what a good choice would be. So the suggestion was to make it configurable, which is simply an easier thing to do. This is how settings are added. After that, the researchers searched the entire mailing list archive and they surveyed users. What they found that there was no evidence that anyone had ever set it. So basically, it's a kind of a management problem. If something becomes too hard to make a decision on, it becomes settings. But this pile of decisions that gets translated into settings, all these settings eventually, is what ends up as a challenge to users. Some people were unable to work out which parameter to set to give the behavior they wanted. Now, as assuring as this study is, I have to point out that this study was about server software, and it's configured through text files by professional admins. And the authors explicitly declined to extend their conclusions to desktop and mobile software, so I cannot really count it as evidence. But I think the interesting thing there is that the study itself helps with something that is a bit narrower, probably as important. In the one domain where settings have been counted against real usage, most of them serve almost nobody. Remember, these are professionals. So all these settings accumulate because adding one is easy and removing one is kind of frightening. This pile of settings generates support calls, confusion, and maybe errors. The term "too many settings" applies perfectly there, and it is actually measured. So this was about professional software. When it comes to consumer devices and consumer software in general, it was very difficult to find something that matches this idea of do we have too many settings. But a bit of old research might be able to help us with that. It's an old study from 2005 in the Journal of Marketing Research. It's called Feature Fatigue. It ran 3 experiments where people evaluated digital and audio players with different number of features. Before using the products, people gave more weight to capability over usability. And eventually they chose the feature-rich models even while predicting that those would be harder to use. After living with their choice, their perspective flipped. It changed. Most of them preferred the simpler model that they had passed over originally. Again, this is a study that we might need to deal with the numbers in loosely. But the shape of the findings does explain something very real. There's a bit of a market dynamic there where people reward capability at the moment of purchase. But then these capabilities become a burden. And every capability we have in any system eventually needs governing, which means that it needs settings. And the settings screen is where we pay the price for the features that we have. Now the third question, which is related to the decisions that we make in a screen like settings. In 2024, a field study followed 132 Android users for 2 weeks, and it asks them, on their own devices, whether a given app currently held a given permission. So it is a bit narrower when it comes to settings. It's about permissions that people give to apps. Let's go through the findings very quickly. For permissions they had granted, 49% of the answers were correct, 21% were wrong, 30% were I don't know. For permissions they had denied, 34% were correct, 31% were wrong, and 36% were I don't know. You have to remember here that all of those decisions were made by the participants themselves. Let's pay attention to the I don't know part. It is the fact that people forgot what they had chosen. The controls are there. The decisions were made by them. But for some reason, they cannot remember what they have done. Things like this, the decisions themselves, are accessible through the settings screens, although you have to dig a bit deeper, especially on iOS, the one I know, to get to them. But this is a common thing among us phone users, where we install apps and give them permissions and then forget what we did a month later. So after all this, all these 3 questions, we looked at what too many may mean from different angles. And if we look at the evidence across all the different questions that I tried to ask about what too many means, the answer will be always yes at some points, but not for everything. Sometimes we do have too many settings against our individual needs. I definitely do not need all the settings on my phone. And one can say very easily, who cares? In a case like this, I would only deal with the settings that I need. I might not use any of the additional settings themselves at all. And this was the case for me before getting into my adventure with parent controls. But if we measure it against what everyone needs collectively, the answer is no, because parents at some point will need family controls. Regulators will require browser choices. That is among many things that regulators will enforce and will find it translated in what we call settings, whether it is cookie settings, whether it is browser settings, or anything else. Almost every setting then is added for somebody, and they end up on this big screen. That somebody is not me. But with all this, it's very difficult to confirm that every single setting we have actually does have a need. There are no official numbers again, but our study, the server study, showed the opposite. Even for professionals, all the settings that exist are not things that they may need. And what we know as well is that removing a setting runs about 7 times slower than adding new ones. This is what matters. That means that every setting added will just stay there. Some aspects of the best practices when it comes to settings are already implemented. We have to place things in more than one area to have accessible settings. We can see that in Control Center in iOS, for example, Quick Settings on Android. On these panels, we can see accessible settings without going to the settings screen, things that are usually common. These panels are also customizable. Another aspect of settings and language, since language is important here, is to think about large language models and agents, because this may be able to help with this gap problem between users' language and systems' language. AI models can predict these things well, and these features are already starting to ship. We see them on Android, and I can see them as well on macOS 27 beta, where I can control certain settings through Siri. But what I find interesting there is that even with LLMs and language understanding, that the actions taken are still very binary. Through the AI-enabled search, for things like settings, I can turn the Wi-Fi on and off. I can turn Bluetooth on and off. But I cannot ask Siri to set the screen time for a child to 1 hour a day, for example. I tried that once and what I got was instructions. Probably things might get better later, but at least for now, we're not there yet. But if we dig deeper, the list of settings is long because the phone itself is now more than just a small computer. It's a thing that holds our money. It holds our identity, our wallets. We can control our house appliances through it. We can do work through it. We can take notes through it. We can control our children's access to the world through it. Every one of these things needs rules, needs settings. And settings is the place where everything is kept. It grew because we handed the device way more to keep. Remember, these devices were originally marketed as very intuitive devices. When I first started to learn about computers, I invested time in understanding settings on my computer, on my desktop operating system, but not on my phone. That wasn't part of the original plan. But phones themselves grew much more than computers. It's no longer about just controlling printers. The issue then is not just about the number of settings. It's about what these devices are capable of and the fact that every single thing that this device can do needs configuration. The problem is, in our current interfaces, that these settings can be only read one line at a time.